On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court handed down its decision. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus the United States. The court ruled 9-0. The verdict was unambiguous. Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. It had used its market position to crush competitors, manipulate prices, and control an industry in ways that the law did not permit. The remedy was dissolution. 34 separate companies, split from the parent, each to operate independently. The greatest corporate monopoly in American history was ordered to be broken apart. John D. Rockefeller was on a golf course in New Jersey when the news reached him. His playing partners stopped. They waited for his reaction. This was, by any measure, one of the most significant defeats any American businessman had ever suffered. A decade of federal investigation, years of litigation, and now the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled against him unanimously. He listened to the news. He finished his round of golf. Then he went home and bought more stock. In 1911, Rockefeller's fortune was estimated at approximately $300 million. By 1913, 2 years after the court had broken up his company, his fortune had grown to approximately $900 million. By 1916, when he became America's first official billionaire, the man the government had tried to cut down to size was worth more than any human being on Earth had ever been worth. The government had tried to break up the monopoly. Instead, it had made the monopolist richer. This is the story of what happened to the Rockefeller family after Standard Oil. It is the story of how a family that built its power on oil pivoted to something less visible, more durable, and more difficult to regulate. It is the story of how the fortune that was supposed to be dispersed became the foundation for a different kind of influence, one that did not require owning an oil company and that could not be dissolved by a Supreme Court ruling. And it is the story of what that influence looks like today, 100 years later, when the name Rockefeller appears not on oil refineries, but on think tanks and foundations, and the institutions that shape how governments and universities and medical systems think about the world. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York, the second of 6 children of a man who sold patent medicines and was, by several accounts, a petty con artist. William Avery Rockefeller, known as Devil Bill to the people who knew him well enough to use a nickname, was absent for long stretches of John's childhood, conducting business of various kinds in various places, occasionally appearing at home with money, and occasionally not appearing at all. John D. Rockefeller grew up understanding that money was not guaranteed, that the people you depended on might not be dependable, and that the only reliable security was the security you built yourself. He was meticulous about money from childhood, keeping a ledger that recorded every cent he earned and every cent he spent, a habit he maintained for the rest of his life. The ledgers survive. They show a man for whom the tracking of money was not a professional necessity but a form of comfort. He went to work at 16 as a bookkeeper for a produce commission merchant in Cleveland. He was good at it. He was good at it in the specific way that certain people are good at numbers, not merely accurate but insightful, able to see in the flow of figures what the figures implied about the business. He saved money. He borrowed to invest. He invested carefully. In 1859, the year Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, Rockefeller was 20 years old and working in Cleveland. The oil business was not yet what it would become. It was chaotic, speculative, and operated by people who were more interested in drilling than in refining or distributing. The men who found oil were making money when prices were high and losing it when prices crashed. The business was not stable. Rockefeller watched this and concluded that the money was not in finding oil. It was in refining it, moving it, and controlling the infrastructure that turned crude petroleum into usable kerosene and delivered it to the customers who needed it. He founded his first oil refinery in 1863 in partnership with a chemist named Samuel Andrews. By 1870, when he incorporated Standard Oil of Ohio, he was already one of the largest oil refiners in Cleveland. By 1879, when Standard Oil's reach extended to most of the country's refining capacity, the question of whether he controlled the industry was no longer a question. He controlled roughly 90% of oil refining in the United States. He controlled the pipelines that moved crude from the wellheads to the refineries. He controlled, through secret agreements with the railroads, the rates at which oil was shipped, and he had negotiated rebates that gave him advantages over competitors that competitors could not match. The mechanism by which he achieved this, The trust structure that gave the arrangement its name and eventually gave its name to an entire body of law was elegant in a way that corporate structures are elegant when they solve a specific problem efficiently. He could not legally operate across state lines as a single Ohio corporation. The trust structure allowed him to hold controlling interests in multiple state corporations under a single umbrella, managed by 9 trustees, of whom he was the most important. The specific mechanics of Standard Oil's dominance deserve more than a paragraph, because they reveal something about how monopoly power actually works that the textbook version flattens. The railroad rebates were the engine. When Standard Oil shipped oil by rail, it negotiated with the railroads for rates lower than those available to competitors. This was legal at the time, though it would later be made illegal. The effect was that Standard Oil could undercut any competitor on price and still maintain its margin because its costs were lower. A competitor who tried to match Standard Oil's prices was losing money. Standard Oil, with its lower transportation costs, was not. But the rebates had a second component that was more aggressive. Standard Oil negotiated not merely lower rates for itself, but drawbacks, payments from the railroads on every barrel of oil shipped by competitors. When a competitor paid to ship a barrel of oil, a portion of that payment went back to Standard Oil. The competitor was, without knowing it, subsidizing the company trying to put it out of business. This was not widely known until the federal investigation made it public. When it became public, it was one of the central pieces of evidence in the case for dissolution. The railroads had been complicit. The railroads were, at the time, the most powerful private institutions in America, and their complicity with Standard Oil produced an arrangement in which the infrastructure of the economy was working against the principle of open competition. Rockefeller did not invent this kind of arrangement. He perfected it. He understood better than anyone else in his industry that the money was not in production, where prices fluctuated with supply and demand, but in infrastructure, where control was permanent and could be leveraged regardless of what the price of crude was doing. Control the refineries, control the pipelines, control the railroads' pricing, control the distribution networks. At each of these choke points, extract a toll from everyone who needed to move through. This is the model that the technology companies of the 21st century would later describe as platform economics, the idea that owning the infrastructure through which an industry operates is more valuable than competing within that industry. Rockefeller did not use that language. He used the language of efficiency and order, but the structure was the same. Own the platform, extract the toll, let others compete on top of your infrastructure while you collect from all of them. The structure was designed to be invisible. The companies that were secretly controlled by the trust appeared, from the outside, to be independent competitors. The appearance of competition masked what was in practice a unified operation. By the time the federal government began to understand what it was looking at, Standard Oil had been operating for over a decade, and the network of control was deeply embedded in the American oil industry. The government's case against Standard Oil began in earnest under Theodore Roosevelt, who took office in 1901 and made trust-busting a centerpiece of his presidency. The investigation produced testimony and documents that established, in detail, the mechanisms by which Standard Oil had suppressed competition, the railroad rebates, the predatory pricing designed to drive independents out of business, the acquisition of pipelines that cut off competitors from their markets. Rockefeller was deposed multiple times. He was famously unhelpful as a witness, claiming not to remember details of conversations and decisions that his interlocutors believed he remembered perfectly well. He was 70 years old, and his memory, convenient as it was, had apparently deteriorated on precisely the topics that the government found most interesting. The trial ran for years. The Federal District Court ruled against Standard Oil in 1909. The Supreme Court confirmed the ruling in 1911 and ordered the dissolution. Here is the detail that the textbook version of this story almost always omits. Rockefeller owned approximately 25% of Standard Oil's stock. When the company was dissolved into 34 separate entities, he received proportionate shares in each. He was, immediately after the dissolution, the largest single shareholder in 34 companies instead of one company. The market did not punish this. The market celebrated it. Investors who had previously been skeptical of Standard Oil's consolidated structure, who had worried about regulatory risk, who had discounted the stock because of the antitrust litigation hanging over it, now looked at 34 companies freed from that uncertainty and saw value. The share prices of the successor companies rose. They rose significantly. The combined market value of the 34 companies within 2 years of the dissolution exceeded the market value of the original Standard Oil. Rockefeller, who had not sold his shares before or during the dissolution, held his positions as the prices rose. His $300 million fortune became $900 million. The government's attempt to limit his economic power had, by the specific mechanism of forcing the market to reassess the value of his assets, tripled his wealth. He became America's first billionaire in 1916, 5 years after the Supreme Court had ruled against him. He did not celebrate this publicly. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man who celebrated his financial achievements. He was a man who tracked them, with the same precision he had applied since the ledger books of his childhood, and who then gave significant portions of them away. The philanthropy is inseparable from the story, and it is the philanthropy that creates the conspiracy layer that the oil history alone does not. Rockefeller had been giving money away systematically since before he was wealthy. This is documented in his childhood ledgers, which show charitable contributions made from the income of a teenage bookkeeper. He gave to his church, to individuals he knew who needed help, to causes he considered worthwhile, and he gave consistently across his entire adult life, regardless of how much or how little he had. As his wealth grew to a scale that exceeded what any individual could productively deploy, the giving became institutional. In 1901, he founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which later became Rockefeller University. In 1902, he established the General Education Board, which shaped American higher education for the next 30 years. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation, the umbrella organization that would coordinate his philanthropic activities and eventually outlast everything else he built. The foundation's stated mission was the well-being of mankind throughout the world. That phrase, well-being of mankind throughout the world, is the kind of language that can mean almost anything depending on who is deciding what well-being means and how it should be promoted. The people who decided for the first several decades of the Foundation's existence were Rockefeller and his advisors, and later his son John D. Rockefeller Jr., and later his grandson David. The decisions they made, about where the money went and what conditions it carried, shaped American medicine, American education, and eventually global public health, in ways that are still operating today. The first and most significant of these decisions concerned medical education. In 1910, a man named Abraham Flexner published a report on the state of American medical schools. Flexner was not a physician. He had a bachelor's degree in classics from Johns Hopkins and had spent his career in education. He had been hired by the Carnegie Foundation to evaluate the 155 medical schools, then operating in the United States and Canada. His findings were largely accurate and largely damning. Many of the schools were inadequate. They lacked laboratory facilities, their curricula were inconsistent, their admission standards were low, and in some cases they were producing graduates who had received minimal practical training. Medical education in America in 1910 was genuinely in need of reform. The Flexner Report recommended that the number of medical schools be drastically reduced, that surviving schools be required to affiliate with research universities, and that medical education be standardized around a specific model, rigorous science, laboratory research, and the germ theory of disease as the central framework for understanding and treating illness. These recommendations were sound in many of their particulars. The problem, the detail that the official history of medical education glosses over, is who funded the implementation. After the report was published, the Rockefeller Foundation and its associated General Education Board began directing money to the medical schools that aligned with the Flexner model. Schools that did not align with the model found themselves without funding. Between 1910 and 1935, the number of medical schools in America dropped from 160 to 66. Schools teaching homeopathy were closed. Schools teaching naturopathy were closed. Schools teaching osteopathy were pressured to conform or close. The diversity of approaches to medicine that had existed in 1910, some of it quackery, some of it genuinely different traditions of care, was largely eliminated. What remained was a standardized model of medicine built around pharmaceutical intervention, surgical treatment, and laboratory research. This model was funded, shaped, and to a significant degree controlled by the largest private foundation in the country. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research was simultaneously developing the pharmaceutical research that the new medical schools would be trained to use. The foundation was funding the education system. The institute was producing the treatments the education system would teach. The relationship between these two institutions, both funded by the same fortune, created a structure in which Rockefeller money shaped both what doctors learned and what treatments existed for them to deploy. The closure of medical schools between 1910 and 1935 is worth sitting with for longer than the standard account allows. In 1904, there were 160 medical schools in the United States. By 1935, there were 66. The reduction of nearly 100 schools represents a transformation of an entire profession's educational infrastructure in the space of 25 years. The schools that closed were not all bad schools, some were. The Flexner Report accurately identified institutions that were, by any standard, inadequately preparing their students. These schools deserved to close. Some were different rather than inadequate. The schools teaching homeopathy, for instance, represented a tradition of medicine with a different theoretical foundation than the germ theory that the Flexner model centered. Whether homeopathy works is a question that has been studied and debated for 2 centuries, and that the scientific consensus has answered negatively. But in 1910, the scientific consensus was less settled than it later became, and the closure of homeopathic schools was partly a consequence of the Rockefeller Foundation's funding decisions before the scientific question was fully resolved. The schools teaching medicine to black physicians in the South were disproportionately affected. Flexner's report was not neutral on this point. He recommended that black physicians should primarily serve black communities, and that fewer black physicians were needed than were currently being trained. Of the 7 black medical schools operating in 1910, 5 closed following the report. The 2 that survived, Howard and Meharry, were specifically retained by Flexner as sufficient to train the number of black physicians he considered appropriate. The demographic consequences of this decision ran for decades. The shortage of black physicians in American medicine, which produced outcomes in black health that have been documented extensively, was shaped in part by a decision made by a non-physician hired by the Carnegie Foundation and funded by the Rockefeller money that implemented his recommendations. This is the specific detail that the celebration of the Flexner Report, which is genuine in its recognition that the report raised standards for American medicine, consistently leaves out. The Foundation funded the improvement of medicine. It also funded the narrowing of medicine in ways that had demographic and cultural consequences that its trustees did not fully anticipate, and that the historical record does not show them significantly regretting. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented history of American medicine in the first half of the 20th century. The Rockefeller Archive Center has the records. The historians have published them. The structure is visible to anyone who reads the primary sources. What the conspiracy theory version of this history does is take the documented structure and attribute to it a malicious intent that the documents do not establish. The simpler explanation, the one consistent with what the records show, is that the Rockefellers believed in scientific medicine, believed in the specific model the Flexner Report recommended, and used their money to promote it with the same single-minded efficiency that John Dee had used to promote Standard Oil. Whether the outcome, a medical system built around pharmaceutical treatments and largely stripped of alternatives, serves the well-being of mankind throughout the world, that is a question the Foundation asked and answered in the affirmative, and that others have asked and answered differently. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937. He was 97 years old, which made him one of the longest-lived major figures in American history, a fact his admirers attributed to clean living, and his detractors attributed to the specific imperviousness of the very rich. He had given away approximately $530 million during his lifetime, which was, at the time, more money than any individual had ever given to charity. The Rockefeller Foundation continued with its own endowment. The University of Chicago, which he had founded and funded, continued. Rockefeller University continued. The General Education Board had distributed its funds and was winding down. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was, in the specific ways that matter for this story, his father's opposite temperament applied to the same inherited obligations. Where Senior had been focused, calculating, and emotionally contained, Junior was anxious, conscientious, and genuinely troubled by the weight of the fortune he had inherited. He did not want to build more wealth. He wanted to be worthy of the wealth he had. This distinction between the accumulator and the steward is the distinction between the first and second generation of most great fortunes, but Junior experienced it with an intensity that produced genuine personal suffering alongside genuine philanthropic achievement. He gave enormously. Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, the complex of buildings that remains one of the most significant urban developments of the 20th century, was his project, built during the Depression when building anything was a statement of faith in the future. The restoration of colonial Williamsburg was his project. The donation of the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York was his in 1946, when the organization needed a home, and Junior decided that having the world's new international institution in New York was worth the cost. He also had 6 children, among whom the fortune was divided, and among whom the most consequential for the family's public role was the youngest, David. Junior's other children were significant in their own ways. Nelson became governor of New York and vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford, coming close enough to the presidency that the question of whether a Rockefeller would become president felt for a period in the 1960s and 1970s genuinely open. Winthrop became governor of Arkansas. Lawrence became a significant venture capitalist and conservationist. John D. III became a major philanthropist focused on Asia and the arts. Abbey became a co-founder of the Museum of Modern Art. The family did not produce one dominant heir in the second generation. It produced 5 governors, philanthropists, and public figures who operated across different domains and who collectively maintained a Rockefeller presence in American public life without any single individual concentrating the family's influence. David was the exception. David concentrated. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had taken over the management of the family's philanthropic and business interests and had, in the opinion of most historians, done the job well. Junior was less interested in business and more interested in giving, and he gave with the same systematic precision his father had applied to making. It was Junior's son, David Rockefeller, who would become the most significant figure in the family's second century, and whose activities would generate the most sustained attention from people trying to understand what the Rockefeller influence had become after Standard Oil. David Rockefeller was born in 1915, the youngest of Junior's 6 children. He studied economics at Harvard and the London School of Economics, received a doctorate from the University of Chicago, and then went to work at Chase National Bank, which later became Chase Manhattan Bank and eventually J.P. Morgan Chase. He rose to become chairman and chief executive, a position he held from 1969 to 1981. Chase Manhattan Bank under David Rockefeller was one of the most significant financial institutions in the world, and its chairman was, by his own account and by the account of everyone who dealt with him, one of the most connected private citizens on earth. David Rockefeller travelled constantly, meeting with heads of state, central bankers, finance ministers, and the leaders of international institutions. He had access that no elected official could match, because his access was not dependent on election cycles or approval ratings. He was, in his own memoir, entirely straightforward about this. He wrote that he had been accused of being part of a secret cabal, working against the interests of the United States to build a one-world political and economic structure, and that he was proud of it and would gladly plead guilty. That sentence has been quoted by conspiracy theorists to mean one thing, and by defenders of David Rockefeller to mean another. The conspiracy theorists read it as a confession. The defenders read it as a man being deliberately provocative about a mischaracterization of his internationalism. What is not disputed is what David Rockefeller actually built. In 1973, he founded the Trilateral Commission. The stated purpose was to encourage cooperation between the United States, Western Europe, and Japan on economic and political issues. The actual mechanism was to bring together, in regular private meetings, senior officials from government, business, and academia across the 3 regions to discuss policy questions and build consensus. The Trilateral Commission's membership has included, across its history, several American presidents before and after their presidencies, multiple secretaries of state, central bank governors, major corporate executives, and the editors and publishers of significant media organizations. Jimmy Carter was a member before he became president. His national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, had been the commission's first director. Several members of Carter's cabinet were Trilateral Commission members. When Carter was elected in 1976, critics noted that a private organization founded by a private banker had produced a president and a significant portion of his senior administration. The critics called this troubling. The Commission's defenders called it evidence that the organisation attracted capable people who also tended to be selected for positions of responsibility, which was circular reasoning that nonetheless contained some truth. What is accurate is that the Trilateral Commission, a private organisation funded substantially by David Rockefeller, met regularly and privately, produced policy papers, and had among its members people who subsequently made policy for the governments of multiple major democracies. Whether this constitutes influence or conspiracy depends on what you believe private organisations of prominent people are for. David Rockefeller was also a long-time member and chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the New York-based think tank that has shaped American foreign policy debates since its founding in 1921. The Council publishes Foreign Affairs, the journal in which American foreign policy positions are often first articulated and debated. Its membership list reads like an index of American foreign policy for the past century. He sat on the boards of multiple universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions. He was the primary force behind the preservation and development of Rockefeller Center, which his father had built in the 1930s. He gave to causes that aligned with his internationalist liberal establishment worldview: arms control, environmental conservation, population issues, international development. He died in 2017 at the age of 101, the last of the grandchildren of John D. Rockefeller Sr. The question of what the Rockefeller influence is today, a decade after David's death, is not easy to answer, because the answer depends on what you count as Rockefeller influence and what you count as something else. The Rockefeller Foundation today has an endowment of approximately $6 billion. It focuses primarily on global health, food systems, and economic development in low-income countries. Its current priorities include pandemic preparedness, climate resilience, and digital financial inclusion. The Foundation's involvement in global health has been substantial. It has funded vaccine development, health system strengthening, and epidemiological research across multiple decades. The structure it helped build through the Flexner Report era, and subsequently through direct funding of international health organizations, is present in the institutions that manage global health today. The Rockefeller Foundation was a founding funder of the World Health Organization's predecessor organizations. It has maintained relationships with the WHO and with global health institutions across its entire history. When major health initiatives are designed and funded, Rockefeller Foundation money and Rockefeller Foundation personnel are often part of the table. The Trilateral Commission continues to meet. The Council on Foreign Relations continues to publish. J.P. Morgan Chase, which absorbed Chase Manhattan, which David Rockefeller ran, is the largest bank in the United States. The family's direct wealth, distributed across the 5 generations of Rockefeller descendants now alive, is spread thinly enough that no individual family member is among the wealthiest people in America. The concentrated power of the original fortune has diluted exactly as concentrated fortunes do over generations. The family that was collectively estimated to be worth $11 billion in the 1970s is today a collection of several thousand descendants with individually comfortable but not extraordinary wealth. What has not diluted is the institutional infrastructure. The foundation continues, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund continues, the institutions the family money built, the universities, the medical centers, the think tanks, the policy organizations continue. They are staffed by professionals governed by boards, funded by endowments that have been invested and reinvested for a century. The Rockefeller name is on those institutions, the family's direct control over them is limited, but the organizations themselves, the ideas they promote, the people they train, the policies they advocate, continue to reflect the world view that the family money initially installed. This is the specific mechanism by which great fortunes outlast their makers, not through the wealth of descendants, which dilutes, through the institutions the wealth built, which persist. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. The companies it became, ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, others, are still among the largest energy companies in the world. The man who owned Standard Oil became richer when it was broken up. The institutions his money built are still operating. The think tanks his grandson founded are still meeting. What exactly was broken up in 1911 is a question worth asking. The 34 companies that Standard Oil became in 1911 have themselves merged, acquired, and consolidated across the subsequent century in ways that have reduced them, again to a smaller number of very large companies. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon, then merged with Mobil, which had been Standard Oil of New York to form ExxonMobil in 1999. ExxonMobil is currently the largest American oil company and one of the largest companies in the world. Standard Oil of California became Chevron, which acquired Gulf Oil and later Texaco. The company that had famously bought Getty Oil in 1984 and then been sued by Pennzoil for $11 billion, Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, which was acquired by British Petroleum. Atlantic Richfield, another Standard successor, was also acquired by British Petroleum. Continental Oil became Conoco, which merged with Phillips Petroleum to form ConocoPhillips. The 34 companies are now effectively 4 or 5. The market caps of ExxonMobil, Chevron and ConocoPhillips combined are currently in the range of $700 billion. They are, as a group, still among the most valuable companies in the world. Their combined market value is approximately 4 to 5 times the market value of the original Standard Oil at the time of its dissolution, adjusted for inflation. The government dissolved the monopoly. The monopoly reconsolidated, not through any illegal mechanism, not through the railroad rebates and the drawbacks and the predatory pricing that had characterized Standard Oil's original consolidation, through the normal market processes of mergers and acquisitions that the antitrust framework permits, through the logic of an industry where scale produces efficiency and efficiency produces returns and returns attract more capital. John D. Rockefeller, watching from wherever very rich dead people watch, would have recognized the pattern. You cannot permanently dissolve something the market wants to exist. The Rockefeller story is usually told as a story about oil. Oil was how the money was made, and the money is the most visible thing about a story like this, so the oil gets the emphasis. But if you follow the family not through the oil fields but through the century that followed, what you find is not a story about oil. It is a story about how a family that made its money in one industry used that money to build influence in the industries that followed: medicine, education, finance, international policy, global health. John D. built the oil monopoly. The government broke it up. The breakup made him richer. He used the money to build institutions. Junior managed the institutions. David expanded their reach into international finance and international policy. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren became the custodians of institutions that operated according to their own professional logics, no longer directly controlled by Rockefeller family members, but shaped by the assumptions and priorities that Rockefeller money had installed over a century. The Supreme Court can dissolve a company. It cannot dissolve a university. It cannot dissolve a foundation. It cannot dissolve the habits of thought that a century of philanthropic investment has installed in the institutions that train doctors and educate policymakers and research diseases and shape the terms in which international cooperation is discussed. John D. Rockefeller said, late in his life, that the accumulation of wealth was a gift from God that carried with it a responsibility for stewardship. He meant this sincerely. He was a devout Baptist who had been tithing since childhood and who had thought seriously about the relationship between wealth and obligation for his entire adult life. Whether his stewardship produced the outcomes that served mankind's well-being is a question that his admirers and his critics have been answering differently for 100 years. What is not disputed is that the stewardship continues. The institutions are there. The foundations are meeting. The endowments are invested. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ordered John D. Rockefeller to give up his monopoly. He finished his round of golf, went home, and bought more stock. The monopoly was on oil. What he built afterward was not something the Sherman Antitrust Act had a mechanism to address. It still doesn't.